Hello everyone, and welcome to our Study of Religions Department seminar, research seminar, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Jonathon O'Donnell, who is a visiting scholar in the School of Natural and Built Environment at Queen's University Belfast. Their research focuses on the relationship between demonology, sovereign power, and the religious right, and has been published in journals like Religion, Ethnic and Racial Studies, and Political Theology. They are the author of Passing Orders, Demonology and Sovereignty in American Spiritual Warfare, published by Fordham University Press in 2021. The book deploys the resources of queer, critical race and decolonial theory to deconstruct religious demonologies in the contemporary United States, demonstrating their relationship to wider formations of American exceptionalism, ethno-nationalism, and empire management. So you're very welcome, Dr. O'Donnell, and I will pass it over to you now.
Thank you, Dr. Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Butler. It's a pleasure to be here. I know several of you in the audience already, and there are several of you that I don't. So hello again to those who know me, and welcome to those who don't. I hope today that I'm going to talk a bit about my research, and I hope you find it kind of interesting and engaging. Perhaps at times entertaining, although it can be rather grim at points, so fair warning. So I'm just going to start sharing my presentation. Okay, I think that should be displaying properly. Okay.
Yes.
So today my talk is titled Demons of Imperial Decline, Demonology and Sovereignty in the Contemporary USA. The majority of the work that I'm going to be presenting on today is based in the research that I conducted for my book, and indeed I'll be reading several passages from it over the course of this talk. But in general, I'm going to attempt to introduce the audience to my research and to a field of fairly under-examined forms of contemporary religiosity in America, although it is gaining more and more prominence in terms of the academic study of religion and theoretical observations in general. So I'm going to begin by reading a passage from the start of Passing Orders. This is the introduction of the book. Around 3:30 a.m., the phone rang. So Pastor Ray Pritchard opens his 2007 book, Stealth Attack. It was his wife calling. It was September 11th, 2001, and a plane had hit the World Trade Center. I don't remember much else about that day, he continues. Eventually, I made my way to the church and met with the staff. That night, hundreds of people gathered in the sanctuary to sing, to weep, to pray. Pritchard proceeds by outlining all the things that were yet to come after that day. The names of Al-Qaeda and of Osama bin Laden, the anthrax scare, the color-coded alert system, the invasion of Iraq. The world changed forever, he says. Yet, as I write these words, despite President Bush was right, he states, when Bush declared that the United States was at war. And, quote, he was right again when he said the war against terror would last for years and it might not end in our lifetime. As I write these words, despite significant progress on many fronts, there is no end in sight, end quote. Well, but yet, while Pritchard may have begun mentally writing the book, as he says, sometime during that long day, Stealth Attack is not a book about 9/11, or indeed about the war on terror, but rather, quote, a small contribution to a conviction that arose from its ashes. It is a new look at an old war, he explains, a struggle that has been going on between good and evil since the beginning of time. It is about spiritual warfare in an age of terror, end quote. For Pritchard, America's global war against terror becomes the modern reflection of a far more ancient but equally global conflict. There is a close link, he claims, between the physical and the spiritual, and what happens in the unseen realm directly affects the world around us. As such, he continues, I have looked at the shattering events of the early years of the 21st century to help us understand our place in the grand cosmic battle between God and the devil, light and darkness, good and evil. In that battle, we are all frontline soldiers, and no one gets a vacation, end quote. The understanding this comparison provokes, however, is not unidirectional. While the language of the demonic has frequently lent itself to conceptualizations of America's foes, from the Cold War to the Imperial westward expansion, to overseas missionary projects and beyond, for Pritchard, those foes also permit a reconceptualization of the demonic itself. In the following chapter, he begins, "Are you familiar with the term asymmetric warfare? There is no better picture of Satan's strategy than the modern concept of asymmetric warfare. Though heavily outnumbered by the armies of the Lord and having lost his personal battle with God, he now uses unconventional warfare to bring down the Lord's people. Indeed," he continues, "Satan is the ultimate terrorist who led the first rebellion in the history of the universe. His attempt to unseat God was the first insurgency," end quote. The war on terror becomes the frame through which to reimagine the war in heaven, a long war in which victory is both ultimately assured, the enemy is outnumbered, outgunned, and already defeated, mission accomplished, and yet constantly deferred. There is no end in sight. Passing Orders is, much like Stealth Attack, a book about spiritual warfare in an age of terror, although that it is obviously quite different in its aims and its scope. The book uses a combination of discourse analysis and various other forms of critical methodology to analyze spiritual warfare manuals, books like Pritchard's, that kind of exist as this hybrid of self-help guide, military tactics manual, and demonological treatise. And it looks mostly at those published sort of during the tail end and following the Cold War, and then during the kind of Bush and Obama years of the war on terror. It uses spiritual warfare and its demonologies as a kind of extended case study for unpacking ideas of temporality, territoriality, and sovereign power in the United States today. And indeed, it uses this as a way to analyze broader concepts of the relationship between what the book classifies as demonology and demonization. That is, demonology as the discursive set of beliefs and practices about the existence and reality and activities of malevolent spiritual forces, demons loosely, and demonization as the sociopolitical process by which those beliefs are mapped onto real-world populations to justify mechanisms of dehumanization. But also, much in the same way that Pritchard did not simply read models of the demonic onto America's perceived enemies, but used the perception of those enemies in the forms of asymmetric warfare to reflect back onto his conceptualization of the demonic. The book is also interested in the way that targets of dehumanization and the classification of sort of targeted populations, whether those are queer and trans people or Black people or indigenous people or the nebulous idea of socialists, for example, are then used as lenses to reinterpret the spiritual world, mapped back onto those kind of underlying demonological structures. And so to begin, and kind of to give a bit more context on this project, I'm going to go through some basics and kind of elaborate the general themes of what the book talks about. So what is spiritual warfare in general? Spiritual warfare is a concept that is fairly present from the early stages of Christianity. It's incredibly prominent, but it's probably its most prominent periods that are covered in the scholarship, at least, are late antiquity, when the early Christian community would use the concepts of spiritual warfare both in the context of, say, desert monasticism to temper themselves into a kind of weapons and soldiers for God within the wilderness, or in the concepts of urban Christianization, through which early Christians would perceive pagan urban spaces as kind of beset and controlled by the demonic, and therefore needing to be kind of exorcised and chased out to kind of solidify the kind of late antique urban spaces, the kind of bastions of Christianity. The period of history, particularly within Europe, where demonology is perhaps most covered by the scholarship, is the early modern and late medieval period, the period that we generally know kind of in discourse as like the witch hunts, the period of the witch hunts, in which kind of elaborate models of demonology were kind of formulated and mapped both by clerics but also by kings, in the sense, in the case of, for example, James VI and I's classic text, the Demonology. Perhaps one of the early texts that explicitly formulates the relationship between demonology and sovereign power, as King James conceptualizes a coven of witches using demonic power to essentially threaten his monarchical rule. However, today, spiritual warfare is perhaps most closely tied to the broader Pentecostal and charismatic revivals of the early 20th century. Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity in this context being those forms of Christianity that put weight in what like secular scholars might perceive as kind of more supranaturalized elements of Christianity. They emphasize faith healing, for example, and prophecy and the power of prayer, but also, and most relevant here, the capacity to discern and then exorcise demonic spirits. The formulation that I most closely study is sometimes referred to as third wave spiritual warfare, and tends to exist in this paradigm that gets popularized from the kind of mid-1980s onwards within the United States. Largely on the back of US missionaries returning from work in South America, Central and South America, something I'm going to talk about a bit more later. Spiritual warfare is, at its core, rooted in the belief in the literal reality of the spirit world, in angels and demons, in good and evil as metaphysical forces that are essentially constantly in conflict. And we'll talk a bit more about the way that that manifests shortly. Sean McLeod, in his book American Possessions, classifies spiritual warfare as working with what he calls the supernatural hermeneutics of suspicion. The idea here being essentially that the spirit world acts as the base of reality in the way that, say, Marxism might cite the economic system, for example. Everything from individual sickness to systemic poverty to national institutions to the rise and fall of nations is processed as epiphenomena or superstructural forces built atop this spiritual base. And shifts in the spiritual base, whether towards the angelic and divine or the demonic, radically transform the physical material spaces that are perceived as influenced by these. The goal of spiritual warfare and spiritual warriors generally is to identify spaces where they see the demonic as powerful or regnant, and then to transform those spaces through a combination of ritual action. This can include, most notably, prayer, what they call militant forms of prayer, also activities such as prayer walks, the giving of prophecy, large kind of stadium-style prayer meetings, but also, and I think this often sometimes goes unstated in some studies of these, political activism. Spiritual warriors are not above running for political office, running political campaigns as a way of affecting what is essentially a kind of form of top-down a bureaucratic transformation in a region, rather than simply a kind of bottom-up grassroots effort, which some aspects of their movement tend to emphasize. In my research, I primarily study the way that spiritual warfare is formulated through an analysis of spiritual warfare manuals. This is a fairly large and extensive publishing industry within the contemporary United States, but generally is a fairly diverse and form of literature. These are kind of three examples that we have here, for example, of spiritual warfare manuals, including Pritchard's Stealth Attack, which was where I began. But generally, as a genre, they run the spectrum from what is effectively a kind of self-help book, filtered through a kind of overtly supernatural lens, in which the believer is encouraged to find parts of their life that they see as wrong or in a state of chaos, identifying these as caused by demonic influences, and then using usually the power of Jesus to kind of exercise these parts of your life and therefore kind of restore harmony to yourself as a person. On the other end of the spectrum, you have books like The Supernatural Life here by Cindy Jacobs, who fall into that category. On the other end, you have what might be classified as kind of more overt conspiracist tracks. The book Forbidden Gates by Tom and Nita Horn here is perhaps a good example of that, in which the focus is far less personal and far more on these kind of macro political issues of governments, international conspiracies, the Illuminati, for example. This book particularly is focused on this kind of perception of this kind of transhuman technological agenda. But what is important to recognize is that a lot of these books exist kind of on this spectrum, and bits of them kind of bleed across into each other. A book like Stealth Attack is perhaps slightly closer to the self-help, but definitely more in the middle, in that it kind of uses spiritual warfare paradigms to conceptualize and process a kind of more macro political issues, but then kind of filters them back to the individual. Most of Passing Orders is focused on a focus on the concept of territoriality and of sovereign power. Sovereign power here being kind of loosely defined as kind of the right to, who has the right, or indeed not the right, to rule a given specific space and to determine its character, its structure, its way of existing. Since the mid-1980s, spiritual warfare developed a focus on what I'm calling here a kind of territorial demonology. Demons were conceptualized as governing and controlling specific geographical spaces. These could be individual houses, famous landmarks, cities, sometimes entire nations or continents. And as a result of this control, these spaces were considered to be kind of bastions of sin, bastions in which like the evangelists were supposed to kind of go forth unto, and sort of using that combination of prayer and activism that I mentioned earlier, transform those spaces in ways more conducive to their understanding of quote unquote God's will. This is important because this idea of territoriality was very, very heavily based on concepts of ownership. Demons were understood as illegitimately possessing ownership of spaces. In fact, Rebecca Greenwood, kind of one of the early advocates of this form of demonology, writing here in one of her more recent books in 2018, claims that demons hold territory illegally, acting as illegal squatters. The metaphor of demons as squatters is something that has a very long history in American evangelicalism, stretching back before the kind of dawn of this form of spiritual warfare to kind of evangelists like Billy Graham, for example, who uses this form of metaphor quite extensively. This notion of improper rule, or indeed of illegal rule, within spiritual warfare frameworks is tied to general notions of prosperity and kind of structural integrity. Within their framework, rule by demons is seen to cause poverty, violence, environmental disasters, economic collapse, generally ways of life that they consider to be antithetical to their understanding of Christianity. This rule is both permitted and reinforced by what they see as sin. Sin here is a very loose category, but is essentially used to conceptualize any ways of kind of being or belonging that do not adhere to their particular understandings of how kind of people, quote unquote, should be. Whether this is gender variance in sexuality, drug addiction, or idolatry. Idolatry here being essentially any form of religious practice that is not their understanding of Christianity. They use idolatry to conceptualize, for example, everything from kind of contemporary paganism to Islam to Catholicism to voodoo or Santeria to kind of a whole variety of other forms of religiosity. Important to factor in with this is the way, and I'll talk about this more in the next slide, is the way that demonic encounters operate within spiritual warfare as forms of enemy reconnaissance and data gathering. And I'll kind of move on to the next slide actually to talk about this, because it kind of talks about it in slightly more depth. So spiritual warfare demonologies, here is Bush being very mission accomplished. I'm sure many of us who are old enough kind of remember this moment. But spiritual warfare demonologies are highly plastic, adaptable, and indeed perfectible, or indeed they process them as perfectible. The idea within spiritual warfare, frequently in its kind of modern conceptualizations, and I kind of have a paper in the works that's kind of about this, is processed through this idea that evangelists kind of go forth often to places outside the continental United States, where they kind of have exotic kind of field encounters with demonic entities that they then kind of bring back and formulate and theorize kind of in the homeland, and then kind of fit within these kind of broad, ever-expansive demonological taxonomies that they kind of build out gradually and extensively over time, ultimately kind of creating these kind of vast theoretical conceptual databases of often slightly ad hoc demonic conceptions. But the way that these formulations, these taxonomies, these frameworks operate is, I think, kind of telling and important, particularly when they're contextualized within the wider kind of geopolitical and indeed domestically political framework in which they operate. Within the US, the way that spiritual warfare demonologies operate, and this is one thing I talk about extensively within the book, often overlaps with the structures of US empire and of US imperial praxis. I should note here that I am explicitly talking about American forms of spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare itself is relatively global, and although there are complex overlaps in other parts of the world, I have, for example, written about its adoption in Japan and the way that this operates with regards to kind of the kind of legacy of US imperial projects within the region. It is quite different when placed outside of the US context. So I am specifically, and the book specifically addresses this within the US. This is kind of present, I think, in the very early phases of contemporary spiritual warfare in the mid-1980s, in which American evangelists and missionaries would go out particularly to Latin America, particularly in places like Argentina and Bolivia, where they would essentially evangelize and kind of gather data and formula and encounters of the demonic that they would kind of bring back to the US, but also processed as ways of kind of transforming these regions religiously into modes they conceptualized as kind of in line with their vision of the United States as a Christian nation. particularly as a Protestant Christian nation. The other place this is very apparent, particularly in the late 1980s and through the 1990s, is this concept that these spiritual warriors called the 1040 window. The 1040 window is loosely the space between the kind of 10th and the 40th lines of latitude north of the equator, and basically covers the geographical region that is kind of the North Africa, the Middle East through to kind of East Asia, covering kind of the Middle East, India, China, Japan, North Africa. This was conceptualized by evangelicals, particularly during the 1990s, as this kind of final frontier of evangelization. It was seen as the region where kind of evangelical Christianity was numerically the weakest, and therefore this kind of region that needed to be converted readily. This is particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union has, I think, a particular crucial role to play in the way that these early kind of mid-1980s forms of spiritual warfare, and indeed in the 1990s, because they are being formulated ultimately by Cold Warriors, kind of comes to play. Early spiritual warfare, I always say early, spiritual warfare in the 1980s, and the early parts of my research, very much relies on Cold War geopolitical paradigms. This is not like my observation, this is an observation that kind of several scholars have made, in the sense that the world is bifurcated into two kingdoms, the evil empire and the kingdom of freedom in this context, that are ultimately governed, that essentially rule geographical spaces and compete for territorial and ideological control of a variety of kind of disputed territories. This in this context being places like Japan, the Middle East, India, etc. And the goal of spiritual warriors within this framework was essentially to go into these spaces and convert them to the kind of the right ideological framework. Conceptualized here as this kind of model of kind of Protestant, capitalist, often kind of white Christianity in the United States. This observation is important because, as Pritchard's category with which I kind of began kind of shows, this is something that actually starts to shift, particularly in the post-Cold War and the War on Terror region. In the kind of particularly in the post-War on Terror formulations of contemporary demonology, the demonic is often processed less as kind of geographical territories, although it is still processed in that way, but often as kind of regional cells on this model of asymmetric warfare. You might have like a city that is controlled by demons, or a neighborhood, or like a small region of space, or maybe even a nation. But essentially, these are processed as almost like rogue states. They exist within this kind of totality of this conception of kind of American and divine power as omnipresent and coterminous. This also plays out in, I think, one of the other ways the demonic tends to get conceptualized, particularly from the 1990s onwards, which is often in the model of the corporation. Demons are often conceptualized as corporate in structure. High-ranking demons are often referred to as the CEOs of like hell's corporate hierarchy, for example. And I think this is telling because this is also the era of the kind of expansion of neoliberal capitalism globally. The point where like the corporation kind of no longer obeys the limits and the borders of the nation state, but is in fact becoming kind of global and decentralized. And so the demonic within this period increasingly becomes modeled in this kind of cellular structure, like either as corporate or on the kind of model, particularly in the post 9/11 era, of the kind of terrorist cell. But essentially what we have here is this idea of the demonic as this thing that refuses to be constrained by not only by the borders of the nation state, but is kind of fractured and fragmented and kind of metastasized through the kind of body of the US kind of global imperium, understood here as a kind of embodiment of God's power. I'm trying to check the time. Okay, so we have We have a little bit of time, but not too much. So I'm going to talk briefly next about one of the more specific things that my book talks about. Because while this is true of the demonic generally, one of the things that Passing Orders does is that in addition to these general patterns, it identifies the way that specific demonic figures or specific demonized figures are used to incarnate kind of distinct threats to this kind of US global empire, like qua kind of kingdom of God within these frameworks. And the three that the book looks at, as I'm going to talk about on this slide, are Jezebel, the Antichrist, and Leviathan. I'm going to kind of talk about these briefly. Each of these takes up a chapter of the book, which looks kind of more closely at them and identifies the way they kind of operate within contemporary spiritual warfare programs. Jezebel is a figure who is essentially ubiquitous within contemporary spiritual warfare. There have been kind of several studies of evangelical texts that have gone out of their way to identify texts as singular because they did not mention Jezebel. Jezebel is modeled on the biblical character of kind of 1st and 2nd Kings, where she is a Phoenician princess and kind of priestess of the god Baal, who marries the Israelite king and kind of within the narrative corrupts Israel like towards idolatry. Within contemporary spiritual warfare, Jezebel transcends this kind of origin as a kind of mortal woman and is kind of transcended into this kind of omnipresent demonic figure. Jezebel as a figure within contemporary spiritual warfare is kind of responsible for a number of overlapping ideas and portfolios. She's frequently identified, for example, with feminism, LGBT rights, globalization. She's sometimes identified with things like the global drug trade, and the kind of the general dissolution of national borders, and also kind of things like sometimes toxic interpersonal relationships as well. One of the things that I talk about and that I cover in the book, and one of the things that I think is pretty crucial with Jezebel, is that she comes to represent what in the minds of these authors are kind of improper or destabilizing forms of identity and practice. Things that upset what they construct as the kind of normative or normal order of the family and of the nation. Forms of relationship that they consider to be improper. Forms of national consciousness or national structure that they consider to be improper. She's also associated highly with immigration, particularly immigration by sort of non-Christians, indeed non-white people, often from the Middle East, but also from Latin America and the Caribbean, for example. Jezebel essentially represents the breakdown of what they consider to be the kind of quote-unquote proper boundaries around normative order. And because of this, she often serves a role that I think is quite analogous to the broader kind of reactionary swing in contemporary kind of reactionary right, both Christian and otherwise, that identifies kind of the forces of feminism or queer rights or trans rights as this thing that is kind of emasculating the West as a broad concept, and therefore leaving it open to kind of infiltration or destruction by kind of nebulous foreign forces. This is a talking point that's very prevalent in the kind of contemporary reactionary politics. And this kind of observation, this framework, then leads me on to my analysis of the Antichrist and how the Antichrist functions. The book here is The Islamic Antichrist by Joel Richardson, a fairly influential book. It in fact got onto the New York Times bestseller list, tragically. Essentially, this is a book about how Islam, as conceptualized as a kind of almost as like an agential force in itself, is identified as kind of not just anti-Christian in a general sense, but is literally kind of demonic in character. Not so much in this book, but this is something that Joel Richardson kind of plans out in a lot of his others. The Antichrist is often conceptualized in hyper-masculine terms. It tends to reflect that kind of broader demonization of Muslims that you see in war on terror rhetoric, and particularly around Muslim masculinity as kind of inherently kind of violent or threatening. And as this thing that's kind of threatening to kind of usurp this kind of feminized, emasculated kind of Western civilization. Within contemporary spiritual warfare, there's a lot of threat that the idea of Islam and Islam as Antichrist kind of incarnates, and is often highly associated with blackness, with immigration, or with obviously with Muslims, but with anything that's seen as kind of somehow like, if anyone is familiar with contemporary kind of reactionary theory, politics of around ideas of replacement, the idea of the great replacement, the idea that kind of Western civilization is being replaced somehow, either demographically or culturally. The Islamic Antichrist often functions as a way for spiritual warriors to kind of process and conceptualize, and indeed sometimes undermine their own arguments within this. The third figure that the book looks at, and I am aware that I'm kind of running short on time, so I'm going to kind of move along, it is Leviathan. Leviathan is a fairly complex figure in the Bible, most famously present in Job. Leviathan generally is often understood to be kind of the biblical variant of the Near Eastern concept of the dragon of chaos, this fear of primordial chaos that kind of exists since the dawn of the world and kind of infiltrates and undermines and threatens the kind of normative establishment of order. Within Passing Orders, I analyze Leviathan in a couple of ways. Generally as this thing that underlies and threatens to disrupt the kind of conceptualizations of the normal order of politics and the normal order of kind of conceptions of kind of Christian nationalist culture. This is most prevalent, for example, in the two examples that I look at in the book most closely, between indigenous forms of spirituality, which are often demonized through associations, for example, with Mesoamerican serpents or crocodiles or dragons, as kind of this force that the American settler colonial system has allegedly superseded, and yet which kind of persists and persistently disrupts the kind of settler narrative of triumph and of finality. The other way that Leviathan is used, and I think relatedly, is with regards to ideas of socialism and of resurgent socialism in the contemporary, particularly with Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, other forms of kind of grassroots resistance. And in the same way that its kind of more settler colonial frameworks kind of use the threat of kind of resurgent indigenous traditions as this kind of model of disrupting of settler temporality, its association with socialism disrupts that kind of post-Cold War narrative of American triumph, the narrative of the end of history, the idea that kind of neoliberal capitalism is like the system now and in perpetuity. It's that kind of disruption of these kind of normative, triumphant narratives of a kind of once and for all history. And so I'm just going to wrap up now, I think, because we are moving towards the end. Generally speaking, and this is something that the book talks about extensively, contemporary spiritual warfare, particularly within its US context, often frames America as at once invincible, triumphant, the incarnation of kind of God's will on earth, and yet deeply vulnerable to attack, whether this is by kind of gender or sexual variance, the disruption of heteropatriarchal gender norms, or through immigration, through multi-faith or multiculturalism, and through a kind of number of, and through the resurgence of kind of non kind of disaster capitalist forms of economic survival. Yeah. As the seat of divine authority on earth, American power and its quote-unquote purity, whether understood in sexual, racial, or religious terms, is thought to be maintained. And this ties into the way that threats to US empire and the US nation in general are often framed as threats to, as Neil Ahuja dryly writes in Bioinsecurities, threats to the whole world, to humanity itself. Here kind of rendered in kind of more cosmic terms. Ultimately, what I kind of argue spiritual warfare represents, or like one of the things that it represents, is this kind of spiritualized reflection of America's imperial statecraft, one that both segregates within and eliminates enemies both within and without. With what Nikhil Pal Singh calls in his book Race and America's Long War, America's inner and outer wars. Yeah. And in spiritual warfare, this conflict, this struggle between, and this kind of duality between the US's inner and outer wars plays out through intertwined narratives of sexual and racial and religious threats to both the normative family and to the normative nation. And thank you. I'm going to, if this sounded interested to you at all, this is the book, and I hope you enjoyed this. And if you have any questions, I would be perfectly happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I think there's a question in the chat that we will start off with from Ian, who says, loved the talk. How much of Hollywood's current output is based on the ideas of spiritual warfare?
I mean, a lot of it probably not overtly, although there is definitely some in, I mean, recent horror movies. If you look at like the Conjuring series, for example, is very rooted in ideas of spiritual warfare. I guess it's kind of like, I guess like clarification on Hollywood, I guess, in this context, because like generally, like narratives of the kind of triumph of good against evil are very, very common in particularly kind of contemporary Hollywood staples. But that's kind of often more rooted in the general kind of American conception of itself as this kind of bastion of freedom and security and triumphalist goodness. But spiritual warfare has definitely been a big influence on, say, like the Conjuring series, although that's more rooted in kind of Catholic conceptions of spiritual warfare, which my book doesn't talk about, but are often quite overlapping. Like there's often less of a distinction there than you might initially process, but yeah.
Any other questions or comments? James?
Hi, Jonathan.
Hey, James.
For that, very interesting indeed.
Pleasure.
Jonathan, could you? I'd like to ask a question going back a little bit in kind of the kind of evolution of spiritual warfare.
Let's go.
Back into the kind of period when kind of Pentecostal ideas started to merge with fundamentalist forms of Christianity, and the kind of the racial reconciliation or the meeting place that had to happen then earlier in earlier decades in order for this highly racialized American kind of white supremacist form of demonology to emerge. There's a kind of paradox there, isn't there?
Yeah, it's one of those interesting things where like contemporary spiritual warfare is actually quite like racially diverse, and the way that it is mobilized distinctly across different racial communities is, I think, quite interesting. My research tends to focus primarily on like conservative spiritual warfare, in which, although it's also quite racially diverse, it's often not very politically diverse. Like a lot of kind of Black conservative like spiritual warfare preachers will still be, for example, like supporting Trump and like Trump policies, for example, around border security. But there is often a slight contradiction. I mean, I remember reading one book by a guy called Stephen Strang, who's like a big pro-Trump Florida-based spiritual warrior who runs a very big evangelical publishing house based in Florida. And he was doing a tour, and he was speaking at a largely kind of Latino church in California. And in his comments, he was like, "Oh, I had no idea that illegal immigration would be such a big issue in this church." Despite, he was quite shocked by not necessarily the difference in the kind of ethnic and racial demographics, but in the way that affected the politics of the church in question. But yeah, it's tricky and difficult, and I think complicated.
Thanks.
So, Piers?
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, it was absolutely fascinating. Really enjoyed it, and I'll certainly get the book. I'm not an expert on the study of religions. My area, in fact, what I'm researching right now is the rise of the far right here in Ireland and beyond. But I'm really struck by the fact that everything that you're describing is completely familiar in terms of the kind of themes, whether it's the upsetting the world of fixed kind of sexual categories or the threat of immigration or whatever. And I suppose my question would be, I'm looking at some of this as well in terms of far-right religious discourse here in Ireland, which primarily reflects a Roman Catholic tradition. And what you're describing is very much a Protestant one, but some themes seem to emerge in common. I hear a lot about the Antichrist, for instance, from these people. There's a good deal of reference to Judeo-Masonic conspiracies and that kind of stuff. There's an extreme dislike of the current Pope, who's a globalist and a modernist and all that kind of stuff. And I suppose I'm wondering, where do these two discourses or these two traditions talk to each other? Is there common ground? Do they talk to each other? And I suppose one other then question, which is not related at all, but can you relate any of this to QAnon as a kind of a popular, conspiracy view? But thanks again.
No, thank you. And thank you for enjoying the talk. And so I guess to address these questions in order, one is that they do talk to each other. This is not an area that I've done a large amount of research. It's probably something I'm going to be looking at going forward. But a good example of this would be after Trump lost the election on December 12th of 2020, there was what is called a Jericho March was organized, which is a kind of spiritual warfare event where basically people will walk around or through a particular space praying to kind of bring the walls down, like happened in Jericho, by which they mean the kind of spiritual walls of this kind of demonic stronghold. But that event was notable because the main speakers who were advertised were both Catholic and Protestant from a number of denominations, and they were united both through this kind of spiritual warfare practice, but also by that kind of reactionary conservative political agenda that here was kind of identified with Trump, and the idea that Trump had kind of not lost the election, had been kind of unfairly usurped by the American democratic process, which then of course leads me on to QAnon. QAnon is a really interesting phenomenon, and it's something I've kind of done some research on, but I haven't published on it yet. There are a lot of spiritual warriors involved in QAnon, a lot of them. The language of spiritual warfare saturates the movement, even among those who are not explicitly engaged with it. QAnon itself is often drawing heavily on both the kind of satanic panic ideologies and practices of the kind of late 80s and the 90s, but also that kind of fear of the New World Order that became incredibly prevalent kind of in the 1990s and kind of combines a lot of these into this kind of meta conspiracy. The specific claims of QAnon around for example, John F. Kennedy Jr. being alive, or Trump being this kind of messianic figure, those are not unique to spiritual warfare, but the language through which they're often discussed is often explicitly rooted in this kind of spiritual warfare paradigm. And indeed, a lot of evangelicals did get on board with it, although a lot of others didn't, which I think should be noted. QAnon caused a little bit of a rift, I think, in the spiritual warfare community, because even among the pro-Trump spiritual warriors, they were kind of looking at it being yeah, this looks a bit much even for us, we're not going to touch that. So
Elizabeth, next question. Sorry, did you want to respond, Piers?
No, not at all. I'll stop things. Thanks very much.
Hi, Jonathan. That was just so fascinating, and it speaks to my daily experience here in America. So.
Oh, I am so sorry.
No, it's really, it's like a very literal interpretation of things rather than symbolic, and it's really, it's there. I have kind of an esoteric question just to throw out there because I'm just interested if you've seen this, but like, do you think there's anything in the Victorian obsession with like Arthurian legends and like the split between the proper Christianity and then this like the serpents and Melusina and all those kind of things that like are very similar to what you're talking about? Do you think there's anything that's related there in the deep roots? I know that like Camelot is an obsession too.
Yeah, I mean,
that's esoteric,
yeah. So it's kind of interesting because, like, in the stuff that I've read, spiritual warfare-wise, there hasn't been obviously any kind of overt callings to Arthurian legend. Although, as kind of I think you maybe suggested there, I think in the kind of broader kind of far-right ecologies in which these often circulate, like there is a kind of fixation on Arthurian legend, on like the Crusades as well, for example, these kind of ideas of kind of quote unquote kind of authentic Western culture. Or I do think there are like similar themes in the sense of the kind of true king's restoration of kind of proper order to things through the kind of the reign of kind of the kind of quote unquote like true king or proper king. Although I think these are kind of more generalized themes that these different discourses are drawing on rather than necessarily any kind of direct genetic connection in that sense. But yeah.
I guess the sovereignty thing too. That
yeah.
I mean, final tear from that, I guess. Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Miranda. Miranda, I'll just read it out because some people can't see the chat. Miranda says, amazing talk. Thank you so much. Your point about territoriality and demons controlling specific spaces reminded me a lot of Cotton Mather's description of the American wilderness as the devil's territories. He also conflated indigenous peoples with the devil in Wonders of the Invisible World, which seems similar to the stealth attack quote about Satan being the first terrorist. It might be a bit outside your area of interest, but is there a relationship between these early American ideas and contemporary notions of spiritual warfare?
Yes and no is probably like, so a lot of contemporary versions of spiritual warfare like don't explicitly hark back to kind of older understandings of these. They often seem like almost notably unaware of these kind of older discourses, whether that's the early kind of settler discourses in America of people like Cotton Mather, or indeed the kind of generalized kind of early modern forms of kind of European demonology. Where I think there is a lot of connection is in the fact that, like, much like in those early periods, like America is a settler colonial nation. And these ideas of kind of the taming of the wilderness and the kind of general demonization of indigenous people that continue to be kind of structuring political and cultural and social elements of the United States, whether overtly or covertly. And I think contemporary spiritual warfare is very much drawing on like that general kind of settler colonial framework within American life, like rather than say specifically on people like Cotton Mather. So like there is a connection, but it's often not explicit. But it is very much like in terms of the kind of the general culture and the general like kind of socio-political framework in which America operates.
So without bringing things too much over time, I had a quick question. Just if you could say something more about transhumanism and how is the satanic agenda understood in relation to transhumanism?
Well, I mean, so part of my current research is actually on this, but also I published an article in 2016 on it, so I can direct. But yeah, generally speaking, it's quite complicated, but it often ties into the general demonization of what they call secular humanism. This idea, secular humanism existing here, like not so much as the general concept of secular humanism, but as this kind of anti-Christian force that exists like in secular society. They see transhumanism very much as like overwriting their kind of normative conceptions of the kind of innate biological human, for example. Sometimes, for example, I've seen claims that like if like a human was to undergo genetic engineering, they could no longer receive salvation because they like would no longer be like genetically human anymore. Which then ties into the kind of broader critiques of, say, like Darwinian evolution that they have, where they don't believe in Darwinian evolution because like because then that would kind of disrupt that idea of the kind of static normative human that kind of persists through time. But yeah, there's generally a lot of anxiety and fear about like the role of technology in kind of reshaping like humanity and like what that means in terms of the capacity for salvation. And they often tie it into kind of apocalyptic narratives of the Antichrist coming and turning everybody into cyborgs or something. But yeah.
Thank you, and I will read your articles.
I will send it to you. Yeah.
Pierce has just put a comment that he's also seeing exotic claimed links between transhumanism, COVID-19, 5G, and vaccines, the idea being to give the elite total control over us.
Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, very much like a feature of kind of New World Order style conspiracies. I mean, if you look back, there's often this fear around like emerging technologies as like the kind of gateway to the end times. Like during the 90s, it was like barcodes and things like the internet and things like that. And then now it's kind of like 5G and transhumanism and things like that. But there is often generally this kind of anxiety over emerging technology and technologies and their capacity to kind of reshape the understanding of kind of what is and is not, quote unquote, humanity.
So one last question, because I realize we've gone slightly over time. From the chat, someone is interested in the reasons why people identify with these movements.
I mean, it's not really something I can perhaps speak to so closely. If I had to say anything, I think it's because, like, one of the things that spiritual warfare does is it allows for conceptualization of the world that is simultaneously incredibly simple and yet incredibly complicated. You can essentially reduce like everything in existence down to a very, very neat binary choice of this is good and this is evil, this is light and this is darkness, this is God and this is the devil. But within that binary, you have a lot of room for maneuvering and critique and conceptualization and reconceptualization and complexity, which I think means that people can kind of both retain a fairly simple worldview that allows for the amalgamation and processing of a wide variety of threats, like under a kind of singular umbrella. Like everything that is threatening is the same in their framework, but also gives them room to maneuver and kind of like construct the kind of nuances of their own worldview kind of within that, give themselves as much kind of complexity and theorization as they require within what is essentially a kind of fairly simplistic framework.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. There's a few comments in the chat from people saying how much they enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure speaking today.